Welcome to the Reading League Wisconsin's second presentation in the Science of Reading Overview series. In this session, we will unravel Scarborough's reading rope, where we will review this conceptual model of reading and take a deeper look at each strand of the rope. For those of you viewing the recording of this presentation, we suggest you go back and watch the first presentation in our Science of Reading series. What is the science of reading? The first session builds some essential foundational information about the reading rope. I'm Amy McGovern, Vice President of the Reading League, and I'm presenting today with my colleague Mary Newton. In an effort to not repeat ourselves, we're going to ask, who are our mentors? Who inspired us? I've been teaching reading or supporting teachers who teach reading for my whole career. And as I look back to my early days as a second grade teacher in Milwaukee Public Schools, I was quite fortunate, thanks to my brilliant principal, Jim Sonnenberg, who's long since retired, to have received a lot of intense training and coaching very early in my career, when my building implemented Zig Engelman's direct instruction programs. My trainers and coaches, Adrienne Allen and Doris Bisek, were quite tough, but fair, and they always had the best interest of the kids at heart. They pushed me to be a better teacher, and I'm forever grateful for their influence. As I've learned more and more about effective reading practices and the science of reading in the years that followed my time in Milwaukee Public Schools, I'm amazed at how lucky I was to have learned something so solid and reliable so early in my career. I certainly recognize that direct instruction is not everyone's cup of tea, and that's 100% okay. But I love how so many of my mentors since Adrienne and Doris, like Anita Archer and Deb Glasser, have really taken the best of direct instruction and made it work for a much broader audience of teachers. Side note, if you stick around in education long enough, you'll gain experience in just about every way there is to teach reading, because that is certainly my story. So off to you, Mary.
Thanks. I would really like to recognize two people who have had a major impact on my science of reading journey. My first training was in Orton Gillingham with an OG fellow, Roseanne Amon, and I'm so thankful that she recognized and taught the importance of phonemic awareness and phonemic proficiency before it was widely recognized and used. And after several years, I had advanced Orton Gillingham training with Marcia Henry, who was a morphology advocate before morphology became popular. And so it was a great advantage to me to have that broad view of English as a morpho-phonemic language. So we all need mentors as we journey into new areas, and I'm just really thankful to have had these two great ones. I try my best to pay it forward by sharing my knowledge with others who are on this same path.
The learning targets for this session are straightforward. When you have an enhanced understanding of the strands that make up the reading rope, you will be empowered to use this information to begin to evaluate your curriculum and your instruction.
So we have a poll. We'd like to know, how much do you already know about the reading rope? We know if you were in session number 1, you have at least seen the reading rope, but we'd like to know how much you know about it, and how is it that if you know about it, how do you use it in your practice? So Amy, can you launch that? And then
Sure.
just take a moment to let us know what how the reading rope figures into your practice, and we'll share the results.
Okay, here it comes.
It's another
It's a
short
two-part question. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 parts, but short.
Yep.
We got about 20 more people out there who could respond.
Okay. Some of you are having a few technical difficulties, so just hang in there. You can always put your answer in the chat if you choose to. Okay, we're about there. I'm gonna end polling if that's okay.
Yep, go ahead and end that.
All right, and we'll share the results.
Oh, that's
So,
interesting. You know, over time, this really changes, because if we had asked this question even 2 years ago, we probably would have had over 50% of people saying, this is the first time I've seen Scarborough's reading rope. But look, we're up to 42% of people on this webinar anyway who are familiar with all the strands, which is, I think, really encouraging.
yes, excellent. And I agree. I remember the first time I saw it was at IDA several years ago with Dr. Louisa Motes, and I was sitting next to my teacher colleague friend, and I hit her on the arm, like, we have to take this back to our district. This is amazing.
Yeah.
So, and that was several years back.
It always takes a while for things like this to make their way, you know, spread out, and so everybody's heard of it. I don't think I heard of the reading rope till maybe about 2010. And once I did, I went like, oh, I'm going to be using this every day in my practice.
So it looks like most of the respondents to number 2, and I know there were some of you that said that this question wasn't working for you, said you use it personally to help you organize your thoughts about the reading process, which is definitely how I've used it also with professional learning, since that's a big part of my job. So, okay, let's stop there and let's keep going. Thank you so much for completing the poll, and sorry for the technical difficulties for those of you that couldn't quite get your answer in. All right.
Okay, so here we start the content of this second session. And as we discussed in our first Science of Reading presentation, Hollis Scarborough's reading rope provides details on the multiple skills that lie within each domain of the simple view of reading. So the decoding strand of the simple view is the word recognition strand of the rope. And this is multiplied by the language comprehension strand to determine reading comprehension. So perhaps as we're moving this simple multiplication equation of the simple view, maybe we're moving it into the realm of algebra when we add in all these additional strands in each of the 2 domains. But there are 5 strands in the language comprehension domain at the top of the rope, and 3 strands in the word recognition domain at the bottom. So remember that under the simple view of reading, both of those domains, the top part of the rope and the bottom part, are essential, but neither one of them is sufficient in and of itself for developing skilled reading comprehension. And weaknesses in one domain can't be overcome by strengths in another domain. You really need them both. And weakness in any individual strand at the top or the bottom can undermine the strength of that strand, as well as the strength of the rope as a whole. So by the way that the rope is set up, you can see that the 2 domains are separate as reading starts to develop. And in fact, the individual strands within each domain are also separate in the beginning. And it's only as the strands within a domain become robust that they begin to interact with each other and work together toward the goal of skilled reading comprehension. The instructional goal is to build all the strands until they're integrated into a strong rope that will support skilled reading. However, until a child can accurately and fluently read the words on the page, they can't work on reading, or they can't work on comprehension through reading. They have to work on it orally. The new reader relies on other people reading to them and engaging them in conversation, oral discussion, and encouraging experiential activities. The early separation of the two domains is also a reminder that word recognition is accomplished through developing the skills in those lower three threads, not developed by using language comprehension knowledge to leverage word recognition. There are some qualitative differences between the two main domains, as we discussed briefly in our previous session. Language comprehension is not constrained by time or by place, continues to develop over the entire lifespan and in all contexts, in ELA classes, other schoolwork, outside of school, experiential activities, self-study. Our language comprehension just never stops growing. And on the other hand, developing word recognition skills is a finite task that's generally accomplished by about third grade, at least at that basic level. And the development of these skills is largely dependent on formal instruction in the English language arts and reading block.
So let's start by looking at the strands in the language comprehension domain. Background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, language structures, verbal reasoning skills, and literacy knowledge. These strands are what enable us to make sense of what we're reading. They initially develop through oral language and are applied to written text once word recognition is sufficiently robust. Over time, with more practice, more life experience, and enhanced metacognitive awareness, children become more strategic in how they apply these sub-skills in the service of reading comprehension. As many of us have witnessed, children vary in the language comprehension skills with which they arrive at school. One of the best ways to build these skills is through wide reading. But until a child can decode proficiently, language comprehension develops through read-alouds and experience. Read-aloud should continue in all classrooms as they are an important pathway for building background knowledge and vocab. We must also consider the text we use with children throughout their day and how that text supports this strand. Because they're not all created equal, right? We must pay attention to this half of the rope from early on to prevent what often appears to be a sudden onset of reading problems in 3rd or 4th grade, when decoding instruction is supposed to be complete and reading for meaning is now in high gear. When children in grade 3 and above can accurately decode text but still can't comprehend it, we often discover that this lack of understanding is because they're missing background knowledge, vocabulary, and/or the verbal reasoning skills are limiting their ability to make sense of the written syntax. It's interesting to point out that the language comprehension strand gives some credence to curricula that builds knowledge starting at a very young age. Food for thought, for sure.
So we're going to start by looking at the background knowledge strand, and we need enough knowledge of the world to make sense of what it is we're reading. And the more knowledge we have, the easier it is to acquire new knowledge because we have something to attach it to. Students come to school, of course, as we see, with varying degrees of background knowledge. And it's also the case that sometimes students have a fair amount of background knowledge, but it's just not in the areas that they're going to be reading or learning about. So the importance of building background knowledge has been emphasized recently by writers such as Natalie Wexler and Daniel Willingham, and has become a major focus of some instructional materials such as core knowledge language arts. And there's an interesting study that came from Milwaukee, my hometown now, by Recht and Leslie, and it's known as the baseball study, and it demonstrates the important contribution that background knowledge makes to reading comprehension. So let's take a look at an explanatory video for some truly fascinating insights about how important background knowledge really is.
Oops.
Hi, the purpose of this video is is to briefly share with you a small section of the Why Build Knowledge and Vocabulary PowerPoint that's available from achievethecore.org. When I first heard about the baseball study by Recht and Leslie, it completely blew my mind and fundamentally changed the way that I teach reading. Recht and Leslie set out in 1988 to answer the question, how big of an impact does knowledge have on reading comprehension? And so they used the text, the baseball guys, and tested four groups of students on their reading comprehension of this text. And the four groups that they separated the students into were those with a high reading ability and a high knowledge of baseball, those with a high reading ability and a low knowledge of baseball, those with a low reading ability and high knowledge of baseball, those with a low reading ability and a low knowledge of baseball. And they tested them on both quantitative and qualitative measures, such as verbally retelling the story and reenacting it with figurines, among other things. What they found was that the high reading ability students with a high knowledge of baseball did about as well as was expected and outperformed the other students. However, the next highest performing group was not the students with high reading ability and low knowledge. It was the students with low reading ability and high knowledge. In this study, low reading ability was defined as having performed at the 30th percentile or lower on a standardized reading test, and high reading ability was defined as having performed at the 70th percentile or higher on a standardized reading test. So let that sink in for a second. The students who performed at 30th percentile or lower on a standardized test did significantly better on this measure of comprehension of this text than the students who had high reading ability and low knowledge of baseball. So what does that mean for us in the classroom? First of all, it shows us that knowledge of the topic had a much bigger impact on comprehension than reading ability did. And before you start to wonder, well, was it knowledge or was it their interest in the topic, another separate study was able to control for that and prove that it was knowledge that caused the students to do much better on this text and their comprehension. And also this study has been replicated several times since 1988 and has proven the same thing every time. Knowledge has a much bigger impact on comprehension than ability. So that tells us that with sufficient prior knowledge, low ability students can perform similarly to high ability students, which means that in our classroom, we have the power to help our students who are struggling readers by helping them build their background knowledge on a variety of topics. It also means that students don't have one reading level, as we've previously thought and have been practicing in our classrooms for years. Each student has many reading levels depending on the topic that they're reading about and their knowledge of that topic. You may even want to read that again, because it's taken me several times of looking over that and thinking deeply about it to really let it impact my thinking and the way that I teach my students. If you'd like more information on this and other research that supports the shifts in practice that the new standards require, you can visit achievethecore.org/ELA-research.
So to sum up, background knowledge is critical in building language comprehension.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, keep going.
What is it you were wanting to watch there?
It's the next video.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay.
Okay, so to sum up, background knowledge is critical in building language comprehension. It can be challenging when we have classrooms of children with varying levels of background knowledge and varying areas in which they're knowledgeable. We kind of want to get them on a level playing field. We need to teach background knowledge content to build a firm foundation for all students, and we need to teach our students to decode proficiently at the same time so that they can continue to build background knowledge through their independent reading. This study by no means means that you can ignore decoding and just build background knowledge. That's not what it's about. But remember that a poor reader with high background knowledge in baseball did fairly well on a reading comprehension exercise using that baseball passage. High background knowledge in a particular area may actually mask decoding problems. We want to be sure that assessments of reading comprehension include passages on varying topics, and we always need to consider both the child's background knowledge and ability to read with accuracy as we contemplate how they are comprehending text. Think of one example of a student who was being evaluated for possible placement into special education for reading problems, and they gave the student only selections to read that had to do with soccer, which was the main focus of this child's life. And he did pretty well on the comprehension outcomes because he was just able to figure things out from his background knowledge. And it wasn't until the parent insisted that he be tested on some different passages that his decoding problems became glaringly obvious. So once our children achieve word recognition, accuracy, and fluency, then they can build background knowledge themselves in so many different ways.
So next on the list is vocabulary knowledge. Just as with background knowledge, kids come to school with differing levels of vocabulary. And here's the kicker. The more words they know, the easier it is to learn new words. I'm going to say that again since there's a lot of implications in that simple statement. The more words they know, the easier it is to learn new words. Just as with background knowledge, not only do we encounter children with different vocabulary sizes, but perhaps even more importantly, they differ in the words they know. Some words are more important in academic learning than others. Unfortunately, not all children are on a level playing field when they enter kindergarten. The book Meaningful Differences documents the landmark Hart and Risley study published in 1995. Their research reveals that as much as a 30 million word gap exists between children entering kindergarten with high vocabulary knowledge and those entering with low vocabulary knowledge. Briefly, the differences were often linked to socioeconomic status. All children in the study were from loving, intact homes. But in homes where parents were very busy trying to make ends meet, there was less time to devote to language-rich experiences. This is a fascinating study to dig into if you are an early childhood, kindergarten, or first grade teacher. The 30 Million Word Center at the University of Chicago is furthering this work by helping parents understand how to build vocabulary by increasing oral communication with their young children. The takeaways for teachers are to communicate in academic vocabulary all the time in school and to encourage children to use this language throughout the day orally and in their writing. Let's dig into that a little bit more. We build vocabulary both formally and informally and through both listening and reading. Reading to children makes a difference, and amazingly, according to Stanovic and Cunningham, many children's books contain more challenging vocabulary than adult conversation or television. So be sure to choose a rich variety of children's literature for those read-alouds. When we consider the task of building vocabulary in children, we first look at words to teach. Vocabulary experts Isabel Beck and her colleagues talk about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 vocabulary in their book, Bringing Words to Life. Tier 1 vocabulary consists of common, everyday words that are largely picked up informally just by listening. Words like house, dog, and run. Most children do not need formal instruction in Tier 1 words, unless perhaps they're English language learners. Tier 2 vocabulary is more academic and is especially useful because the words are used across academic areas. There's about 7,000 words in the Tier 2 level. Words like constitute, establish, characteristic, quality, and verify are all examples of Tier 2 words. These are words that are encountered more often in text than in conversation, and they move across several subject areas. Tier 3 vocabulary is necessary for advanced learning, but it's strongly connected to really just one domain-specific area at a time. These are content-specific words like photosynthesis, cotangent, diminuendo. They should be taught in that specific area of study when the time arises, because there's about 400,000 of these words. So they really are domain-specific. For purposes of selecting words for formal instruction in school, we get the most mileage from teaching Tier 2 words. One thing to note about English learners, while they may be conversationally fluent, meaning they have adequate Tier 1 vocabulary, and they may learn domain-specific Tier 3 words in their content area classes, they may have a hidden weakness in Tier 2 words that's reflected in their academic reading comprehension and their writing. This is true because Tier 2 words can shift slightly in their meaning depending on the context that wraps around them. So how do we find those Tier 2 words? The Coxed academic word list, listed in the resources at the end of this presentation, is helpful for selecting Tier 2 vocabulary for formal instruction. It's worth noting that words related in spelling are often related in meaning, so an intense dose of focused, explicit word learning can springboard into independent word learning as children read on their own. We want to elevate our students' word consciousness abilities. After choosing our words for instruction, the next question is, how should we teach them? We want to do this explicitly and ideally over several contexts in school. We need to make sure the students can pronounce the words, compose a functional definition in their own words generally, and use the words correctly in context, although that does not mean that they should be able to say the word in a sentence on their own. That can create all kinds of problems with syntax and appropriate use. So next we want to provide sufficient repetition for them to retain their meaning. So a cycle of review and practice is very important when teaching explicit words. It's often helpful to group words by theme or in derivational families with the same root or base word or affixes. And that goes back to the idea that words related in spelling are often related in meaning. And we want children to hone in on those root words to help them understand what it is that that word means. Many of these instructional techniques are explained in Isabel Beck's book, Bringing Words to Life. So in summary, the vocabulary strand lives in many subject areas and in many parts of a child's day. The more expansive your oral vocabulary, the easier time you will have decoding, building reading fluency, and understanding what you are reading. As teachers, we can contribute to the informal acquisition of vocabulary by speaking with high-level vocabulary and encouraging children to become word conscious or word detectives. Celebrate when students notice and inquire about challenging words. I once had a 5th grade teacher who had a special poster on the room in her classroom wall, and every time students came across a new and unusual word, they would get to put that word up there and they would have a chance to talk about it. So she had this great environment of building those word detectives and that raising that word consciousness. And that was in a high poverty school. Okay, one more point. We can intentionally teach specific Tier 2 words and help students make connections between those words with similar meaning or similar structure. Remember that English is a morphophonemic language. So that means meaning and speech sounds linked together. Morpho means meaning, phonemic means sound. The more words you know, the easier it is to add new words to your vocabulary.
So the next strand under language comprehension is language structure. Sometimes you'll see it called syntax. We don't usually use words just in isolation. We use them in sentences or in connected text or connected conversation. Syntax or sentence grammar is needed to understand how those individual words are related and how the structure of the sentence affects the meanings of the words. Although we can teach syntax by analyzing examples in text, it often makes more sense to teach syntax in the context of student writing, where they get to generate sentences on their own. We had several advanced questions about the writer's workshop model of instruction and teachers being frustrated with the mechanical aspects of their students' writing. So I just wanted to address that briefly. In a writer's workshop model of instruction, students are often missing the foundational sentence level writing skills that are necessary to produce clear, meaningful text. So while some students may absorb syntax knowledge from reading, many are not able to create and vary sentence structures without explicit instruction. Just because a child speaks with standard English syntax doesn't mean that they can utilize that in writing. And what about the children who come to us speaking other dialects or with English as a second language? They may have mastered the rules of syntax in that dialect or in that first language, but not be familiar with the rules that govern standard academic English syntax. And this creates an extra learning challenge for those students that we need to be aware of. We also need to understand that it's not a question of one dialect being correct and another being incorrect. They're simply different. They're both governed by a set of rules. They're just different rules. Language structures play an important and a complex role in understanding both spoken and written language. Many children you'll find who have decoding problems also have problems in the language comprehension area with sentence syntax. And teachers often find a need to supplement the workshop model, if that's what they're using, with some explicit skills instruction in sentence level writing. So we're not going into great detail on writing in this presentation, but there were a couple of advanced questions submitted about inquiring about a conceptual model of writing similar to the reading rope that we have for reading. So this writing rope was created by Joan Sedita, and it breaks down writing into component skills in a way that you'll see is similar to how the reading rope sorts out reading subskills. And you see in this rope sentence syntax and text structure as two of the 5 main areas of instruction for writing. So for more information on the writing rope, you check out Joan Sedita's website. It's Keys to Literacy. She also offers excellent resources and professional development specifically related to the language comprehension strand of the reading rope and how those skills relate to writing. So to wrap up this strand, language structure, syntax, grammar, this strand of the reading rope, instruction, I should point out that instruction these days is trending in this area toward functional grammar in writing rather than rote memorization of parts of speech in isolation. We don't see that much anymore. Instruction should include practice with bare bones sentences. In other words, learning that what makes a sentence is having a subject and having a predicate. And then using modifying words, adjectives, adverbs, modifying phrases, and modifying clauses as ways of enhancing sentences and expanding their meaning. We also need to teach combining sentences into compound and complex sentence patterns, creating topic sentences, combining sentences to create paragraphs, and arranging paragraphs to generate connected text. So this type of sentence level instruction is where I would look if you have students who routinely generate run-on sentences and incomplete sentences. We need to go back to this sentence level instruction to cure run-on and incomplete sentence habits, as well as the ability to generate sentence variation. I have had all 4 of my kids have come home from school using a writer's workshop model with comments on their papers to please vary their sentence structure. And they had no idea what that meant because they were never taught sentence structure. So by studying syntax, you can see how you can take two simple sentences, combine into a compound or complex, take a modifying clause or phrase and move it from the end of the sentence to the beginning. All these are ways of taking the same content and just varying the structure of your sentence so that your writing has more variety in it. If you're looking for more insights on writing instruction, in addition to Joan Sedita's work, we recommend checking out William Van Cleve's work in his book, Writing Matters, as well as Natalie Wexler's The Writing Revolution. So all three of these experts, Joan Sedita, William Van Cleve, and Natalie Wexler, provide excellent professional learning in writing, vocabulary, and more. Watch for online webinars from these three people. And their work is 100% curriculum neutral too, which is very helpful.
The next strand in the language comprehension domain is verbal reasoning. It's also referred to as semantics. In writing, we think of semantics as word choice, but on the reading rope, we expand this notion into verbal reasoning skills. This is the ability to use higher level thinking to move beyond the literal meaning of the text. Here's where we practice making inferences by combining the text with our background knowledge to construct meaning, and where we learn about figures of speech that aren't meant to be taken literally. You can clearly see that the other strands of the rope are needed to support verbal reasoning. And it's also worth pointing out that the sentence is really the kernel. Susan Smart writes that in her book, Next Steps in Literacy Assessment. The sentence is the kernel of all reading comprehension and all writing abilities. So spending time at the sentence level, verbally, orally, and in writing, it's just a win every time. Okay. When asked about language comprehension skills they teach, teachers often mention spending time on activities that promote the development of semantic reasoning through strategy instruction. But we have to remember that these verbal analytical skills depend on having a robust background knowledge and vocabulary, as well as the ability to read accurately and fluently. Teaching analytic strategies and comprehension strategies in a void is not really the answer to reading comprehension and to building children who can read and comprehend. We need to use the text as a springboard for verbal reasoning skills. Okay, so making inferences is one aspect of verbal reasoning that text instruction supports. Another is figures of speech. Sorry, I've got two screens working, so I have to be on the right screen. Another is the figure of speech, such as these. So we'll click through them slowly, recognizing those figures of speech, which are metaphor. Brad was a shining light in his class. Hyperbole. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Understatement. You might be a wee bit sore after your car accident. What does that mean? Pun. I know the drill at the dentist. I know the drill at the dentist's office. Haha, I love puns. And irony. A fire station burns down. Irony. So these are all figures of speech that really trip children up, and we need to take the time to help them understand what these mean. And then, of course, personification. My computer threw a fit yesterday. It takes a lot of verbal reasoning to tease out the nuanced meaning of these phrases. An instructional tip would be to take the time to ask intentional questions, pre-planned questions about the text, and require students to respond in complete, thoughtful sentences to explain their answer. You want to model and practice this, take the time to dig in deeply, Even though it feels like you might be shortchanging something else, this is the kind of activity that pays dividends down the road. By teaching the content of the book using carefully crafted intentional questions, you support the development of verbal reasoning skills.
So the final strand in the language comprehension domain is literacy knowledge. So if you haven't gotten the picture already, you can see how even within language comprehension, it's so important to not just develop these sub-skills in isolation, but they need to start working with each other. That's how they become more strategic. And then there's always this dance between language comprehension and word recognition. That needs to be coordinated. So the final strand is in language comprehension is literacy knowledge. The scope of what we mean by literacy knowledge changes as a student moves from a beginning reader to a mature reader. For young children, literacy knowledge includes basic concepts of print, such as reading left to right, top of the page to the bottom, how to hold a book, how to track from one line to the next, how to track from one page to the next, the purpose of punctuation, and so forth. For older readers, language or literacy knowledge also includes a developing knowledge of characteristics of different genres of text that will help students both understand pieces of writing that they're reading as well as organize their own writing. Within narrative text, for example, there are specific characteristics to explore that define the personal narrative genre, mystery, science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, short story, novel, and so forth. And within informational text, it's helpful to discern the unique organizational features of a report versus cause and effect, versus opinion piece, versus persuasive essay, and so on. Even within poetry, there are a variety of rhythm and rhyme schemes, as well as some very unusual sentence structures that you wouldn't find in everyday speech. Pragmatics also plays a role in literacy knowledge, studying how to adjust our writing style to our intended office. So we have to be clear whether we're writing books, academic writing, letters, diaries, or any other form of writing.
Okay, it's time to switch gears to the other strand of the reading rope, the word recognition strand, my personal favorite. Before we delve in, let's take a slight detour to look at Linnea Airey's phases of reading. Linnea Airey's model helps us see how the word recognition subskills in the bottom of the reading rope develop over time along a continuum. Note that these are not age-dependent phases. All readers go through these phases no matter what age reading instruction begins. It's important to think about those subskills in light of a developmental continuum. How do children develop essential word reading proficiency? And how does instruction guide that development? Airey's model explains the journey through the word recognition strand of phonemic awareness and phonics on the route to automatic sight word reading. Most models show just 4 phases, though Airey has indicated that to become truly automatic, there may in fact be a separate phase, not listed here. And these phases all overlap. Let's look at them through the schooling lens. Pre-alphabetic is generally happening in pre-kindergarten through kindergarten. Partial alphabetic is generally happening in kindergarten and first. And then full alphabetic is generally happening in first and second, with consolidated alphabetic beginning somewhere in second and carrying on through the upper grades. Linnea Airey's work has been foundational in our understanding of the continuum in both reading and spelling. Again, it's important to recognize that these are not stages, but phases. They are not discrete, but they overlap. So let's dig in a little more. In the pre-alphabetic reading and writing phase, the child may use incidental visual cues to pretend read familiar words, but that they do not yet understand that letters represent speech sounds. So for example, a 2.5-year-old points to the lettering on a mailbox and says, mailbox. She's recognizing the environmental print and associating it directly with its function or meaning, not its speech sounds. Preschoolers love to label, so this makes a lot of sense for that stage. Their writing may resemble a scribble more than letter forms. The partial alphabetic reading and writing stage. In this stage, the child has some letter knowledge and some phoneme awareness, and they may represent some words in their writing, which might look something like this. There'll be things missing. I walk to the mailbox is what that's supposed to say, but they're missing some things. In the full alphabetic reading and writing, the child has phoneme awareness, knows basic sound symbol correspondence, and can sound out words and spell phonetically. In writing, the child provides a letter or letters for each sound in the word, even if it's not the conventional spelling. So here we're a little closer. I walked to the mailbox. You can see some phonics happening here, but it's not exactly right. Consolidated alphabetic reading and writing, the child uses conventional spelling, has an ever-increasing number of words that they recognize automatically. They use strategies to figure out unknown words, and they may segment words into their morphological units. Because the recognition of words is mostly automatic at this point, attention can be devoted primarily to comprehension. So here's what their writing would look like, basically correct. So it's important to note that this model is descriptive of the phases that students move through. It's not really an instructional guide, though it kind of feels like that as we go through it. If a child is in the pre-alphabetic phase, for instance, we really don't want to spend time helping them identify environmental print as an instructional strategy. Our goal is to move them to the next phase where they begin to associate sounds and letters. So the key here is really the right instruction at the right time. Explicit systematic instruction in phonological and phoneme awareness, letters, letter sound correspondence, word structure, and morphology are all required to arrive at that consolidated alphabetic phase with a large automatic sight word lexicon. Take a drink here. Each phase relies on the skills acquired in the previous phases. So again, it's not exactly a guide, but it does help inform our thinking instructionally. Just a word of caution about the term sight words. We'll be defining that further in this series, but as we examine each strand of the rope, suffice it to say that we are not talking about memorizing a stack of words on flashcards, because that would assume that reading is a visual process. And if you watch our first series, you recognize that it's not a visual process. There's much more going on.
So now we're moving back to Scarborough's reading rope, and we're going to be down in the bottom half, the word recognition part of the rope. We're going to consider the 3 skill strands that are involved in word recognition: phonological awareness, decoding and spelling, and sight recognition of familiar words. Always remember that simple view of reading and how easily it maps onto the reading rope. Decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. This theory's been proved over and over again in reading science research. The decoding factor, which is where we are now, is absolutely essential in this equation. This area, this bottom part of the rope, is more technical than language comprehension, and it requires knowledge of the structure of English language in order to feel comfortable teaching all children. Sometimes we may be, most teachers are proficient readers themselves, but a lot of that reading ability came from intuitive insights into how language works. And what I found when I started teaching children who were struggling, I needed to learn myself, to consciously learn how words are structured, so that when a child was having trouble, I could see where the trouble was and I could explain it. It wasn't enough to intuitively know how to read myself. So that's one of the challenges, I think, for teachers who may not have that knowledge of the structure of English language yet, and need that in order to feel comfortable teaching all the children and be successful doing that. This is also an area where, despite long-standing findings from science of reading, there is the greatest conflict over how to teach. So there's not as much conflict over how to teach skills on the language comprehension strand. There's a ton of conflict, and has been for decades, on how to teach word recognition. Children do vary in their ability to master word recognition, and an important insight is that word recognition is a skill that's not related to intelligence. So very bright children, average children, and low-level intelligence children can all either have excellent word recognition skills, or they can really struggle at that task. They're just not related. With the right kind of instruction and practice, and this is also important, children become more automatic in reading words, that they demonstrate fluency, so they can devote more of their attention to comprehending. So remember that until a child can decode proficiently, language comprehension needs to develop through read aloud, above the reading ability of the child, through conversation, and through experiential activities.
So let's start now with the first strand in this domain, phonological awareness. It's a hot topic, right? There's often some confusion between those PH terms. Whoops, come back here. Phonological awareness, right? These PH terms. We have phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. It's understandable because they all start with phon or phone, and which means speech sounds. But as we move through the next few slides, the differences between these three phone words will definitely, we hope, become more clear. Simply put, phonological awareness is the ability to discriminate and manipulate speech sounds. These could be large units of speech sounds, such as sentences or syllables in a word, or smaller units of speech sound, such as onset and rhyme in a single syllable word. The smallest unit of speech is the phoneme. And this is the level of discrimination we need to get to in order to read and spell. Phonological awareness does not involve letters, but we apply our phoneme awareness when reading and spelling with the use of letters. Pure phonological awareness involves not only oral language and speech sound, pure phonological awareness involves only oral language and speech sounds. It's something you can do with your eyes closed. Here's a graphic representation for the full scope of skills under the umbrella of phonological awareness. In the descending size of the pails, we see the awareness of increasingly smaller units of speech sounds. And in the shovels, we see a hierarchy of phonemic skills that go from simple at the bottom to advanced at the top. Most of the skills in the phoneme hierarchy can also be applied to each of those bigger pails. In the process of learning about phonological awareness, we begin at the word awareness level by orally playing with rhymes and alliteration, and by identifying word boundaries in a spoken sentence. So you could use that with chips. There's a lot of ways you could do that. Then we learn that a syllable is a word is a word or part of a word that contains one vowel sound. The awareness that each spoken syllable is built around a vowel sound is extremely useful for beginning decoders and spellers. We also learn that a syllable has a rhyme with an I, which is the vowel sound and any sounds that follow. We learn that a spoken syllable often has an onset, which is a sound or sounds preceding the vowel sound. So stay with me. For example, we have the word flirt. The word flirt is one spoken syllable. The rhyme is irk, and the onset is full irk, onset rhyme. For children who have trouble with the concept of rhyming with an H, they can't do it, it often helps to know that rhymes are created by changing the onset of a syllable. So listen, dirt, squirt, pert, curt, yurt, and hurt all rhyme with flirt. Dirt, squirt, pert, curt, yurt. Remember, we're talking about spoken rhymes, that last part of the word. So spelling does not matter here because this is an oral task. We want to key children in to the parts of the word that sound the same, the rhyme part. And you can see how its parent rhyme with an H helps to support the later work we'll do with rhyme families, the ake family, the at family, and so forth. So finally, that smallest unit is the phoneme, and that's the entire goal of all phonological awareness work, is to get to the phoneme level. That's why we do it. That's what Kilpatrick wants to get to. That's what Hegarty wants to get to, that final phoneme single sound. So let's look at that a little more closely. So as we begin to work on the hierarchy of skills that apply to each of these pales, we become consciously able to identify and manipulate speech sounds. All phonological awareness work has one desired outcome: to produce phonemic awareness, the single sound within a word, phonemic awareness. Some students develop these skills naturally, while others need explicit instruction. Because phonemic awareness is so foundational to reading, we want to be sure that all of our students get the instruction they need to be successful in these tasks. Instruction in phonemic awareness should be based on student need, not on the student's age or a specific number of lessons in a curriculum. Think about what students need. Phoneme awareness builds in a logical fashion. So let's play with the word sun. The first 3 scoops we take out of the phoneme pail are simpler tasks. Okay, and we build upon these very carefully from that onset rhyme skill. In the word sun, the onset is s and the rhyme is un. As we move to pick up the first phoneme shovel, we isolating the first sound s, and then later we would isolate the final sound n and the middle sound We're not going in order. We're going in order we're not going in reading order. We're going in the order in which is easiest to hardest. So first sound, final sound, middle sound. That's the order that works when you're teaching oral isolation tasks. Then we play a little more and we work with identifying which sound is the same in this list of words. Sun, sit, slump. Which one is the same? Which sound? And they would say the s sound. Next, we categorize which word does not belong. So this is more of a language task. Listen, sand, band, stop, sun. Which word doesn't belong? Sand, band, stop, sun. And of course they would say band because it starts with a different phoneme. These early phoneme awareness skills are often accomplished by early to mid-kindergarten. The next stage that we're looking at is segmenting and blending. I'll say a word slowly, and then you put it back together. That's blending. Listen. What word? Sun. The opposite of blending is segmenting. To segment, we say the word sun, and then we say the sounds in that word. Accomplishing blending will allow us to begin to decode and read by blending together the individual sounds we see in print. Accomplishing segmenting will allow us to begin to encode or spell by separating out those speech sounds in the word so we can map on the appropriate letters. So if you watched the first session, I talked about not living only in the land of an isolated program like Hegarty's work, but trying to tie some of that phoneme awareness work to your phonics so you can help children begin to blend and segment the words that they will be seeing in print and writing orally first. Okay, so basic blending and segmenting are typically achieved by the end of kindergarten and sometimes in early first grade. We teach blending and segmenting fairly early in kindergarten and often concurrently with those lower level skills you see on the screen. However, an older child who has not yet mastered blending and segmenting truly needs this instruction as well, regardless of what age or grade they are. Finally, we move into the last phase, the last task, which is our manipulation tasks. Let's switch the word to sand. The first skill in order of complexity is deleting a sound. So we say sand, and we delete the s. What word do you get? And. The next task is adding. Say sand, now say sand again, but add at the end. What word? Sander. And then finally, substituting. Say sand, but now change the a to ow. What word? Sound. So substituting is the highest level of the manipulation tasks. These manipulation skills do not develop until later, sometimes as late as third grade or beyond, though I have personally screened a very small number of pre-K children who can already do these advanced skills, because that's just how far they are. They already hear the patterns, they can tease it out. So these are not necessarily age dependent, but in typically developing children, manipulation is not really solidified often until the slightly older grades. According to research by Linnea Airy and David Kilpatrick, these manipulation skills are what allow a reader to go from sound-by-sound decoding to developing a lexicon of automatically recognized words. Because phoneme manipulation is so critical, we want to be sure that we don't stop phonemic awareness instruction in first grade. And to my Wisconsin colleagues, when you review the Common Core State Standards Revised, which I was on that team, we added manipulation tasks and phonemic and phonological tasks throughout fifth grade. You'll see manipulation in there when you're peeking around. So just a side note.
So before I go on with the decoding and encoding strands of the lower part of the rope, I just want to re-emphasize what Amy said, that ability, that manipulation of phonemes, the advanced level of phoneme manipulation, research has shown that that's what enables readers to go from that halting sound by sound decoding to being able to read fluently. I was first aware of that about 2015 when David Kilpatrick came out with his Essentials book, and he talked about it in there, and Linnea Airy talked about it in 2014. It took me a while to grasp that concept, but think about it, because that's what we need. We need our kids to move beyond step-by-step decoding. We need them to be able to read fluently, which means, that's our sign that their brain is working automatically and they no longer have to use up 90% of their bandwidth to decode the words. Now they have the ability to think about what they're reading. So it's so important to reach that automatic level. And 10 years ago, I would struggle with students who just couldn't seem to reach that level. And this is the key for how to get there. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that. So
Before
now
you go on, Mary, one
Yeah.
more second. The David Kilpatrick, those of you that are looking at his Equipped for Reading Success book, one comment that you'll notice is that there are no addition tasks in his book. He does deletion and substitution at all the different levels, from the word level to the phoneme level. And the reason for that, a dear friend of mine and who spoke with David directly, shared that the research body he looked at did not include anything with addition. So he did not put that into his work, which is why you won't see addition in Kilpatrick's Equipped for Reading Success. It doesn't mean that it's not important. He only included tasks that were represented in the research that he was looking at. So, side note, over. Let's keep going.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you. Thank you for
You're
bringing
welcome.
that
I
up.
just learned it. So sharing new learning. Every day we learn.
This is what I mean by you just learn new things every day. So now we're going down to the second strand in that bottom part of the rope, decoding. And this includes the alphabetic principle and the spelling to sound correspondences. This is where we begin to connect the phonemes that we hear with the letters that represent them in speech, or sorry, in print. And that's what we call that process phonics. So you could call this strand of the rope phonics. It includes decoding and encoding. So the alphabetic principle, as we talked about in our first presentation today, is the concept that our written letters and our letter combinations represent speech sounds. This is not a concept that's readily apparent to many children. They're just not used to thinking of words in this way. Each phoneme, which is the smallest unit of speech that you can divide a word up into, corresponds to a grapheme, which is a letter or a combination of letters that represent that particular phoneme in print. Even after understanding the alphabetic principle for decoding and reading, which many students grab onto fairly easily, they may not connect it to encoding or spelling and just continue to approach spelling as a task of memorizing a sequence of letters. We want to be sure that they're using sound symbol correspondences for spelling as well as for decoding. So we need to understand that decoding and encoding are really just reverse processes, with decoding going from the print to the speech, and encoding going from the speech to the print. So when we decode, we look at the print and we recode it into speech in our brain. When we spell, we think the word in our head or say it aloud. We go from the speech sounds of that word and convert it, map on the letters that we need to put that word into print. So print to speech for decoding and speech to print for encoding, and we need to do both. Effective phonics instruction will teach a sound symbol correspondence in both directions, from speech to print and print to speech, in order to reinforce that concept. Because we tend to teach what is assessed, and most of our assessments involve reading rather than spelling, there is a tendency to give spelling short shrift in phonics instruction, and this is short-sighted. This is one of the things that I've learned in the last several years, and that is that spelling actually reinforces reading more than reading reinforces spelling. So don't think that your students are just going to pick up spelling by doing a lot of reading. They're more likely to pick up reading by doing a lot of spelling. So we want to do both, but whatever you do, don't give short shrift to spelling. So we want to briefly highlight some additional areas of study that complement phonics instruction and will make for a more fully rounded word study experience. This is all about our language not just being a phonemic language, but being a morphophonemic language. So first, along with teaching phonics for beginning reading and spelling, it helps to have a knowledge of syllable structure. This is the context in which students are going to encounter those sound symbol correspondences. it's very important to point out that up until this point, all of our syllable work was at the oral language level. And once we introduce phonics, we teach 6 written syllable patterns. This is something that when I learned to read, I was never taught syllable patterns. I just kind of intuitively recognized the different patterns and generalized them and hooked up the appropriate sound of the vowel with the appropriate syllable type, but it wasn't something that I was explicitly taught or that I ever analyzed. So when I got ready to teach struggling students, I had to learn this so that I could teach them because they needed things explained more explicitly than I did. So just be aware that spoken and written syllables are not exactly the same all the time. The boundaries between the syllables in spoken language may not line up exactly with where we put the boundaries when we're talking about written syllable types. Learning about the structure of the 6 written syllable types in English helps students in a couple of different ways. It helps them discern the correct pronunciation of the vowel and to better visualize the breaks between the syllables in multisyllabic words. So we suggest incorporating written syllable instruction into phonics lessons. It'll be interesting to students who are adept at language and perhaps don't really need that instruction, but it will be a critically important aid for struggling readers. So as I said, there are only 6 syllable patterns to learn, and they're really valuable for students. So we'll do at some point, we'll do a separate presentation just on 6 syllable types. A second area, complementary area to phonics, is morphology. So although for beginning readers, we focus on the phonemic basis of English, the speech, sound, written letter, correspondence, English is actually a morphophonemic language. And morphemes are the smallest units of meaning in a word. Morphemes are either prefixes or they're suffixes or they're base words or roots. So those are the units of meaning in a word. And in addition to focusing on meaning and building vocabulary, which are ways that we use morphology up in the upper part of the rope for language comprehension building, we can use morphology in the word recognition strands of the rope to help students read and spell words more efficiently by using larger chunks. Of course, you have to understand the phonetic, the phonics that goes into those chunks before you can use the chunks. So for instance, if I want to teach a prefix un, I need my student to know that the letter U represents a and the letter N represents n when they're seen together in a closed syllable. And then we can start using that chunk of un and not break it down letter by letter. So using morphology helps us use larger chunks. And we can really start the study of morphology quite early with simple morphemes such as the S or the ES that we put at the end of the word for a plural suffix. Or we can use the ED that we put at the end of a word to indicate past tense. And we can use some common prefixes like un or non or miss, which are decodable at an early level in a phonics scope and sequence, and then will enable children to decode faster by seeing those chunks, while it also gives them a clue as to the meaning of the word. So as readers mature past basic phonics instruction, learning some common Latin roots and Greek word parts can help them decode and understand the meaning of related words such as inject, dejected, and rejection. They all have the J-E-C-T root in them. So understanding that, learning that root helps us connect those words, inject, dejected, rejection, recognizing them more quickly and linking on to something about the meaning. Same thing for words like thermal, thermometer, and hydrothermic. All have that Greek word part, therm. And if we understand that by studying some morphology, it'll help us with our decoding and with our vocabulary. So the third complementary area that builds on basic phonics is etymology. Not entomology, study of bugs, but etymology with no N in it. And that concept is just that words all come from somewhere. and their language of origin helps to explain their spelling. English is a hodgepodge of words that come from many other languages, including Latin and Greek and Germanic languages, Nordic languages, and more. Some languages, when they take in words from other countries, they change their spellings to reflect their orthography in their language. But in English, very often we keep the spelling of the language where the word came from. And so learning, if we have a word study program that includes some etymology, that study of word origin, it's going to, whether intentional or not, our knowledge of Greek, for example, is going to help us spell words like graph, where we use a PH for the F sound, myth, where we use the Y for the I sound, and chorus, where we use the CH for the K sound. If we understand that there's a reason why we use those odd spellings, and the reason is connected to the etymology of the word, or if we have some knowledge, if we've been taught some knowledge about French, it helps us spell words like ballet with the ET making the A sound, chef with the CH making the sh sound, and boutique with the QUE making the K sound at the end. So just being taught a little etymology will really help us both in decoding and encoding words that come from other languages.
Okay, thank you, Mary. That was such helpful information. The final strand in the word recognition domain is sight recognition of familiar words. This is perhaps a confusing term because sight word means a lot of things to teach to educators, and we are going to tease this apart right now. So sight word is often used to mean irregular, non-phonetic words or high-frequency words. In both cases, we may be under the mistaken impression that these words need to be memorized by sight, hence the name sight words. However, in the science of reading, sight word refers to any word that is recognized immediately and automatically. These words may be regular or irregular, high frequency or rare, but once their spelling, pronunciation, and meaning are known and have been linked together, they are recognized automatically and unconsciously without effort. So moving from sound by sound decoding to automatic sight recognition occurs through a process called orthographic mapping, described by both Linnea Airy and David Kilpatrick. Once a word has become a sight word for you, you cannot not read it when you see it, and the meaning will be activated almost instantaneously. This is why it's so important to teach phonemic awareness. A side note, many of the words on a Dolch high frequency list are phonetic, so you don't want, there's no need to make kids memorize those. You want them to decode those, and you want to teach them in such a way that they are recognizing the part that might be irregular and identifying the sound that those letters are making that's different from what they would usually know. It's a very doable process. Okay. So we've had time to just touch on orthographic mapping today. You could literally spend hours digesting what that means, but we have put some additional resources for you on our slides at the end of this presentation. Orthographic mapping is that process by which words become automatic sight words. So let's read this quote from David Kilpatrick. Orthographic mapping is the most important scientific discovery you've never heard of. And maybe some of you have, because you might be on those science of reading sites on Facebook. But it takes some time to really dig into what this means. So whether readers develop orthographic mapping naturally or require a lot of instruction and practice, it happens the same way in the brain. Doesn't matter. It's just some kids catch on very quickly and they self-teach almost immediately, it seems like. My niece was in that category. And then there's other children that need extensive, explicit, systematic instruction. In both cases, what's happening in the brain is exactly the same. It involves connecting the phonemes or the sounds in a spoken word to the representative graphemes or letters in a written word. In the typical reader, it takes 1 to 4 trips through this process before the word is orthographically mapped and becomes instant and automatic. Orthographic mapping does not occur through simple exposure to the whole word. It is not related to the shape of the word. And it does not get facilitated through flashcard drills. Flashcard drills can be helpful in practicing words that have already been learned, and we're trying to increase the automaticity of those words. They've been graphed, phoneme graphing mapped, but it's not the first step in the process. You don't want to begin with flashcards. You want to move that way to the end where we're trying to increase the rate of recognition for children. Proficiency at both phonics correspondence and upper-level phoneme manipulation tasks are definitely basic requirements for successful orthographic mapping. Moving from sound-by-sound decoding to automatic recognition of words is critically important in freeing up cognitive capacity for applying our language comprehension skills and thinking about what we're reading. Okay, we have one more fantastic quote from Dr. Kilpatrick. If you'd like to read it with me, you certainly can. Understanding word recognition development, particularly orthographic mapping, represents the key to unlocking the mystery behind most reading difficulties.
Thank you, Amy. So this really, we're almost out of time here. We took more time than I expected. This concludes our look at the strands of the reading rope, and we could easily spend a week talking about each strand, and we do plan to go into more detail in future presentations. We just have a couple minutes for Q&A. If you're attending live, stay on for that. The Q&A, it will be very brief and it won't be included in the recording. I want to show you some of these. We do have some.
Here we go.
Okay, so here are some of the resources that we suggest. On this first slide, we have resources for exploring Aries reading phases and the background knowledge strand of the reading rope. And then we have on the next slide suggestions for learning more about vocabulary and syntax. And note that the first link on this page is the link to that Coxhead academic word list for help in selecting Tier 2 academic words for formal instruction. The next slide has suggestions for learning more about phonological and phonemic awareness strands. And the next slide has resources on decoding and sight word recognition and orthographic mapping. The next slide has resources for syllables, morphology, and etymology, all of which go beyond phonics to create deeper word study. And again, if you were in the first session, you will have seen these same books. These are books that make excellent additions to your library. And for this particular presentation, we would consider beginning with either Speech to Print by Louisa Moats or Equipped for Reading Success by David Kilpatrick. So we are inviting you to stay in touch with us with Reading League Wisconsin for announcements of presentations that are coming up with you. We're always excited to share. And this is the end of the recorded session. And if those of you who are